I'm Marjorie True. I'm a member of the Paonia community up here on Lamborn Mesa, and I've lived here since 2007 when my husband and I moved from North Carolina. I am a nurse and a nurse practitioner. My last period of time of work was with hospice. I was a hospice nurse and a nurse practitioner working with Dr. Heidi Marlin with the Delta Hospice Care Center, or Delta Hospice with Hope West, yes. Returning to Western Colorado, I graduated from high school, from Junction High, and left soon after that. Returned because I have so much history here. I also had bought property with my daughter and son-in-law, Marla and Stu Carlson, up here on Lamborn, and we moved in order to build and be closer to family. And I was able to settle here. As part of our history, our family history actually extends back to the early 1900s with my family, my mother's family, the Tigrotenheises, moving from Iowa to Fruitland Mesa to form a Dutch colony on the western portion of Fruitland Mesa in the early 1900s, yes.
And what brought?
They brought it in, I think, from Gunnison. I'm not sure how they brought the trees in, but the majority of trees were brought in on the train, probably to to Delta, and then brought up by wagon. There were a number of trees that were brought over Black Mesa from Gunnison too, and planted in the area. This was really a big fruit growing area since the early 1900s, yeah. So, they came in the fairly early 1900s, about 1907, from Hospice, Iowa, where they had formed a Dutch colony after they immigrated from Holland. My great-great-grandfather immigrated from Friesland, and then the Tigrotenhuis family from Gelderland, which is in southern Holland. They immigrated because they were farmers and hired labor. And there was no way that they could buy land. They could never accumulate enough money. There was a famine, particularly with loss of the potato crop, very much like in Ireland. There was a blight in the potato crop, and many of them weren't able to produce enough food for their families even. They found that their religion was jeopardized because the politics in Holland restricted the continuing with the Dutch Reformed Church and moved a different direction as far as the church doctrine. And they felt that that was much of what they lost as far as their freedom. Many of them were serfs or very, very poor. And they saw the possibility of immigrating to the United States. There were actually huge ships of Hollanders that immigrated from Amsterdam to the United States. The ship that my great-great-grandfather, Stuart Sitma, immigrated on a ship with over 300 other Hollanders, landing in Baltimore. And he has a hour-by-hour movement of them, the families from Baltimore to Salt Lake, and then from from St. Louis. They went to St. Louis, and then they had a group of men that were the leaders that went up into Iowa to look for an area where they could homestead and develop their own farms and could set up their colony in northwestern Iowa in Sioux County. They set up farms and they developed businesses in that area. The Dutch that immigrated or moved from Hotchkiss to western Colorado came with, again, seeking land and being able to homestead on Fruitland Mesa was a big motivator for them to be able to develop more land and to become the colony, to develop the colony itself. My grandfather?
Your grandfather.
They first moved to Crawford. He built a small house that's still standing in the valley there in Crawford for his family. He moved with 4 children. He, his wife, and 4 children. My mother was the youngest. And he had a blacksmith shop in Crawford. He began to clear the land on Fruitland Mesa, clearing out the junipers and clearing rock, and began to plow the land to start putting in the orchards. He actually moved a schoolhouse, bought a schoolhouse and moved it from Crawford 10 miles to the western portion of Fruitland Mesa to build his house and barn there. The Dutch were very, very industrious, very hard workers, had large families. My mother is from a family of 12, 4 boys and 8 girls. And the Sitma, John and Dina Sitma, who were had 2 daughters that married and moved to this area. The Dembestas also moved here, and they had 10 children. So they were large families, and they were very hard workers. Granddad felt it's important that women didn't work out in the field unless they do field work. They maintained the home, and there was a lot of work because they fed not only their 12 children, but they also, when they had hire that came in to plant the crops and to harvest, they would stay at the house, and Grandma would feed them. He also had a blacksmith shop.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather, Ed, and anyone that brought supply came in to have work on any of the livestock or work on the wagons, they would feed them also. So Grandma was very busy preparing food for the family. And the 8 girls were very involved in maintaining the home and supporting the men that were working in the fields. Yes.
Did your mother grow up in Crawford?
She grew up on Fruitland Mesa. She was 3 years old when they came from Hotchkiss, Iowa, and was just a year later that they moved to Fruitland Mesa. So she was the youngest at the time. My Aunt Marie was actually born in Crawford. She was the 5th child. And then they added 7 more children. Yeah. So the last was Paul, and he was born on Fruitland Mesa. And then they moved into Hotchkiss, where they lived up on Hanson Mesa for a while, and they moved then to the small house that's in the valley before you go up onto Rogers Mesa. That's where the youngest child, Paul, died of diphtheria. And so they lost the 1 child. Otherwise, the children prospered. They really did. All but John graduated from Hotchkiss High School, and the sisters helped support each other through school. So they would be supported by their sisters to attend university. Many of them went to Western State in Gunnison. And two of my aunts went to the Denver General Hospital and graduated as nurses. All the other women were teachers and taught, many of them taught here in this Western Slope area. So Mom loved Fruit La Mesa. It was such a beautiful area. If you ever have a chance to go out to Fruit La Mesa, to wander around, particularly in that Diamond Joe Gulch area, it's amazing. She loved being there. They had such fun. Granddad built a large barn, and they would haul the hay up into the second story of the barn with hay mows, they called them, and they'd move the hay back on a track. And the girls loved to go up and sleep in the barn on the hay until they heard wild animals outdoors, and then they'd haul their blankets back in the house. But they also liked to hold the mow and go along the track and drop into the hay. And one story Mom told was when Marie was up dangling from the mow, and there was no hay, that the hay had been removed from the barn, and Marie was yelling, "I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall." And Mom was trying to pull hands full of hay so she had something to land on. And John, the oldest, was amazing. He actually built a sled out of part of the track from the mow that extended beyond where the mow was over the length of the outer length of the barn. He took that track and made a bobsled for the kids to come down Anderson Hill. It wasn't. I can't remember the name of the hill, but they sled down, and they had such a wonderful time sledding. They also had a big pond, an ice pond, where they cut ice and put it in a small house that Granddad had built, and stacked cedar chips around it to preserve the ice through into the summer. But they'd also skate on the ice pond, which was great fun for them. They had a wonderful time swimming in the pond and the creek behind the house. Some of the interesting stories Mom told was they had a cistern, and they'd fill the cistern in the spring and the fall. But the cistern had to be cleaned, so they lowered the smallest children down to the bottom of the cistern to sweep the dirt out and they'd haul the dirt up in buckets and then pull the children up last. The other thing they did, the Anderson and Cry grade are very steep going down into Smith Fork Canyon. And every spring, in order to be able to clear the roads, Grandma and Grandpa very cleverly made it a big picnic, so the children would go along the road, throwing rocks off the road, and then they thought it was such a lark than having a picnic together. The children had a great time together, the sisters particularly. They would often match up. They would pair up between the Dembestas and the Tigrotenheises, and they'd do a lot of their play as cousins together. Growing up together was really very important to them. Yes, they had a school. They started school early. Tassel had school in his home for his children, and then as the colony grew, they built a school on the Tassel property, and then Granddad Sitma gave land for a school, and they had one of the first schools beyond the Tassels was an old log cabin that they had school in. And then they outgrew that, and that's when they built the school on the Sitma property. Yeah. The school actually, part of the school is now Charles Chasteen. Charles Chasteen lives on Fruitland Mesa, owns the property where the DeSalle house was. And part of his house is one of the old schools. So they had some wonderful, there was 8 grades. For a short period of time, they had a 9th grade. And one teacher would teach all the students in all grades. So, and my mother remembers it as an excellent education. Often the older children helped the younger children as they learned, and younger children probably learned somewhat faster because of the shared information in the schoolhouse there. When they moved into Hotchkiss, they went to Hotchkiss High School, and then went on to, majority of them did get an advanced education. Yes, my mother became a teacher after attending Western State, and she taught on Redlands Mesa. She was traveling from Hotchkiss up to Redlands Mesa, which is about 5 miles by horseback, and it was cold. And she stopped at the Barton residence, and that's where she met my father. He gave her a muffler, or a scarf, after she warmed up. And so of course, she had to return the scarf. So, well, after they were married, they kept their marriage secret because teachers were not allowed to teach if they were married. And so they kept it secret.
Why not?
It was against the rules. She went ahead and got an advanced education at Fort Collins and then after that, Mom and Dad moved to Glenwood, where Dad had a business. So, yeah. One of the things that's important is to recognize that the strength of the Dutch, the amazing ability to make fairly rapid transition, or the motivation in order to have more for their families, and the work that they put in order to to settle the land, to put in crops, to develop a religious community, to develop a community that supported each other, and to prosper. And when they weren't able to prosper because of the difficulty of farming at that altitude, as well as the challenges for water in an arid area, they were able to move into, become very much a part of this society in both Hotchkiss and Crawford. You know, I think it was a time where there was so much immigration from a large number of Germans immigrated here, and there were Dutch, and primarily. I didn't hear of adversity. I think the challenge was being able to provide for their families and to form support systems within the towns and the areas where they settled. And that truly was support, because they would gather for harvests, they would gather for building homes and barns, they would gather if there was disaster. The Spanish flu hit this area very definitely, with loss of families, death of family members. There were disasters too, horrible accidents with loss of family members, and how they supported each other through these trying times. Yeah, I think there was support that was a little bit more specific when they were to travel extensively required was a challenge because it was muddy in the spring, deep snow in the winter. Mom wrote about often they would have almost spoke deep mud trying to pull the wagons. They had very limited gravel. There was no paving of any of the roads. So it was a challenge to get into the towns itself during the heavier weather. So in times they supported each other right there within the colony. And they provided for almost everything they had as far as food. There was a mill, both a lumber and a grain mill in Crawford, where they would carry their wheat and grind it. So they were very self-sufficient as far as flour and just the stored food that they maintained through the winter. They did a lot of canning, a lot of drying, a lot of preserving of their food. So a lot of it was very independent living or supporting each other within the colony itself.
Why did the colony disband?
It disbanded because they couldn't survive on Fruit La Mesa. The farms just did not thrive. They often would have these farm cells, and that's where they would pick up equipment to continue farming themselves, but ultimately Granddad had sold everything he had. He wasn't even able to sell the house. They just had to abandon the house, and it was sold for taxes. My mother raised 7 children. 6 girls and 1 boy. We outnumbered again, predominantly female. And she was a teacher, but also ran a small daycare center in her home when we were younger, so that she could be at home. And then went back to teaching. She taught in Grand Junction. She taught in a school at Riverside that was with children with disabilities for a short period of time. She taught up on Coal Creek, that is up above the monument on Glade Park. And then she taught one-room schoolhouse there. One of the last one-room schoolhouses in the Colorado area. And then she also taught up in Kebler, a small schoolhouse there. Oh, she was very much a guide for her daughters and son. She was very caring. She was willing to take time for each of us with our special needs when we were challenged as a growing individual, and we prospered much due to the care she provided. Dad was out often away because he traveled as a salesman for large equipment, particularly with mining and with the uranium boom that we had on Western Slope. Well, once the Dutch colony moved away from Fruit La Mesa, Granddad became very involved as a trustee at Methodist Church in Hotchkiss, and we were Methodist in Grand Junction. Yes. I was born in Nebraska. Actually, my mother and father moved to Nebraska where Dad had sold farm equipment. and they stayed there until Dad became very, very ill and returned to Hanson Mesa then. So I was about 4 or 5 years old when we moved from Nebraska back to Hanson Mesa. And then from Hanson Mesa, we moved to Grand Junction. So I left Grand Junction to go to school in Colorado Springs. I went to Beth Hill School of Nursing and worked in public health, and then married my husband, who was in the Army, and we spent 2 years in Pakistan, where our 2 older children were born, Mark and Lisa. Returned with Lisa just 3 months, and Larry got it discharged from the Army because Vietnam was breathing on our necks, and he went to school in Oklahoma, and then we moved back to Colorado, where he ultimately worked for Frontier Airlines when it was a real thriving company, commercial airline.
What year was that?
That was in we moved back to Colorado and lived north of Broomfield in 68. And then our youngest child, Marla, was born in 69. I was teaching childbirth education classes then and started back to school myself to get my degree. I didn't work as a nurse during that period of time, raising my children. And then we left in 73 and moved to Missouri. Larry's father died accidentally, and we wanted to be closer to his mother. And so we were in Missouri, north of Kansas City, and Liberty, where the children attended school. And I finished my degree and received my master's degree as in maternal child focus, and then became a clinical nurse specialist at that time, working at Children's Mercy and teaching. I taught a lot. I taught associate degree nursing in Kansas City, and at Graceland it was a baccalaureate program. I taught at Graceland, where I got my bachelor's degree, and then in North Carolina I taught at a historical African American university in North Carolina, A&T, which was fascinating.
What did you teach there?
I taught pediatrics. I either taught maternity or pediatrics. Yeah. I had been working as a nurse practitioner with a cardiology and internal medicine practice up close to the Blue Ridge. And we had bought property here on Lamborn Mesa with my daughter and son-in-law. My husband retired, and we moved here in 2007. We co-owned 20 acres, and we built our home here up here on Rober Road, here on Lamborn Mesa. It's absolutely beautiful. Mount Lamborn is in my backyard. Can't be beat. For 7 years after we moved here, I worked for hospice, as I said. And so I became very involved in that whole hospice structure. I was involved. We have a wonderful group called Neighborly Neighbors. Lamborn Neighborly Neighbors is a group of women that was formed during the Second World War. Women supporting women, often with their husbands fighting the war. And that continues. We have Neighborly Neighbors on a monthly basis now, continuing to support each other.
What does Neighborly Neighbors do?
We have regular meetings. We have funny little auctions so we can support organizations in the Paonia area. If anyone is ill or anyone has loss, we support them during that period of time. We developed a group called A Little Help, or joined a group as out of Denver. And this group is specifically to help seniors, support them so they can have the choice of remaining in the home. Often as we get older, we aren't able to drive as safely, or we aren't able to maintain the yard, and so, or make some minor maintenance in the house, and that's what we provided were amazing volunteers that would drive people to appointments, help them shop, help them with yard work, and that has now become totally focused in the North Fork area. It's called the North Fork Senior Connection, and supporting our seniors in the area. The Paonia Methodist Church. We actually provide a meal a month for Abraham Connection, our homeless shelter. We have a great group that goes down and prepares food. So when the guests come into the homeless shelter, they have a hot meal in the evening. We also help support them as far as just assuring that this shelter remains open. I am also a member of the Hotchkiss Crawford Historical Society, and we have an amazing museum in Hotchkiss that has so much history. Stories about families that have formed businesses, have prospered in the Hotchkiss Crawford area. One of the biggest challenges is that we recognize that there is change. The change we want, hoping to support, is the agriculture and the tourism that has brought financial resources to the area. That is in contrast to, in many ways, the fossil fuel extraction here in the area with coal mining and the intent to frack and drill in our water sources. And that's a challenge, is to maintain the purity of our water and our air. That's one of the driving forces of our multiple organizations, the Western Slope Conservation Center and Citizens for a Healthy Community. I hope that it remains a community of support, that there is not a division, that we're able to resolve differences in a way that supports the businesses as well as the infrastructure of the community, maintains the natural resources that we have here, as well as the possibility of it being a center for vacationing to a certain extent, a center for biking, for hiking, for camping, the wonderful rivers creeks and rivers that we have for fishing, the wildlife. I'm constantly impressed with the wildlife around me. Herds of deer that come into the fields every evening.
What else do you see?
Elk. We see elk pass in the backfield, eagles, wonderful red-tailed hawks, amazing flocks of birds that come in and fill the trees, geese and flying overhead. What do I do for fun? Well, I have 2 wonderful grandchildren that are close by. Having family close is wonderful. And so many friends. We enjoy the Paradise Theater. I'm a member of Blue Sage and enjoy the concerts and the different functions, whether it's the art exhibits or the music with different performers coming into Blue Sage, the restaurants, although they are sometimes few. I think there'll be a growing number. We've got wonderful restaurants and amazing food here.
When you came back to Colorado, did it feel like coming home on some level?
It did. I think we were both ready to come back. We were coming back to a daughter that was in her family that was already here. And then my other daughter, Lisa, followed us, and so we have formed a family here. My son's still in Liberty, Missouri. Yeah. He'd like to be here too.
Maybe someday.
Maybe someday.